Tony, thanks very, very much for talking to us
That's my
this
pleasure.
afternoon. We'd like to know, could you just brief us on your history with the St Ives Times and Echo, where it started, how you got involved? It's been your lifetime's work.
Yeah, but it's it goes back a very long way. The family of St Ives newspapers started in 1889 with a chap called James Ewing White, who was who'd been a journalist on the old Cornish Telegraph, and he decided to it was time. The time was right for a newspaper in St Ives. What made him think that way was the tourists arriving, and he actually noted that the tourists arriving were predominantly artists and from the London literary scene. And he thought it would be a good idea to document the visitors. So the title of his paper, of his first newspaper, was the St Ives Weekly Summary, Visitors List and Advertisers. Now, in later times, when the historian Cyril Knoll looked back at that, he thought that was a strange Victorian quirky thing to do. He kind of missed the relevance of what James Ewing White was trying to do, which was to start to documentary the history that we're at the other end of. So that newspaper, after 10 years, another newspaper was founded in St Ives called the Western Echo, and that was founded by the Jacobs brothers. And their motivation was totally different. They basically wanted to document and record the fishing industry, the trade, the general trade that was going down along. So James Ewing White carried on for about 20 years with his paper. About 20 years. And then he sold it to Martin Cock, who had a printing works where we are now. Not in this actual office, because this only dates from about 1970. This used to be a rose garden. But he had his offices. The printing works is exactly where it was. And in fact, I can remember in the early 60s when we did a little bit of decorating, such as you could do. We stripped some of the wash off the wall, and we had the walls had been completely covered with posters from the 1880s. We had things like the tariff for the local school, you know, how much it cost a child to go to school, sort of 1 in 6 a term and things like that.
Did you save this?
And unfortunately, no. They weren't really salvageable because they'd been pasted onto the wall on top of each other and all the rest of it, and then been plasters on top. And Martin Cock didn't buy the title of the magazine. There's an interesting bit of a story there that James Ewing White actually sold it to the Cornishman, but he appears to have sold the makings, the furniture, the type, from to Martin Cock, and Martin Cock appears to have carried it from 4th Street, where James Ewing White had his office, to this office, and about 3 weeks later the St Ives Weekly Times appeared, looking absolutely identical to the St Ives Weekly Summary. We don't know quite what went on there, whether it was sort of a dirty deal. I think there was a bit of racial memory in the Cornishman that somehow never quite forgive us, because from time to time, you know, that paper developed a competitive attitude, although most of the time that I knew it, we were very cooperative. And it might well have been, I don't know this for sure, but there was a time when the great St Ives patron and patriot Edward Hayne was a proprietor of the Cornishman, and at that time there might have been some sort of gentleman's agreement to help each other out there. That was discovered, or that story was discovered, well, at the time that this got put together, which is the catalogue for the Tate exhibition in 1985. And the curator that did that and was doing research of it, David Brown, discovered that the Weekly Summary, which I had assumed, because we only have the bound copies of the Weekly Summary until 1910, that those bound copies were all there was of it. But David had discovered copies from 1910 to 1918 in the British Library newspaper library in Colindale Avenue, where he was researching the art history. And then we realised what had happened, and the Cornishman published a Weekly Summary then from 1910 through to the Great War. Then it merged into the body of the paper. In 1919 they dropped it. Martin Cock continued with exactly more or less the same ethos as James Ewing White, documenting the artists. And in 1919 he sold this building and the houses he had at the front to the Midland Bank to raise sufficient funds to buy Lanham's next door. And Lanham's, of course, had started the art services, framing, sending the pictures of the people that White documented up to the Royal Academy, and supplying paint materials and things like that. So Martin Cock then moved into Lanham's and took over the Lanham's studios. And then a few years later, in the early 30s, he was one of the major influences and founding members of the St Ives Society of Artists, which is probably now the main art organisation in St Ives. So that's basically it. In 1958, 57, when my father, who basically acquired the St Ives Times in 1951, which is when we came down here from the Midlands, he merged the Western Echo with the Times, and that's how you get the title today. But the fundamental ethos of documenting art as the major activity that has gone on in St Ives since the 1880s is essentially kind of ingrained into the editorial of the paper.
I'm fascinated by that. I didn't know that the paper actually started because of this growth of the artists and Unit Society coming to Cornwall and what was going on in St Ives.
Yeah, that's right. And it's unique in that. I mean, David Brown, that's one of the things that David Brown found. No paper's consistently done that anywhere with art.
So your relationship to the artist then was almost in your DNA. It wasn't an accident.
Well, yeah.
It wasn't just a journalist being interested.
No, that's very no. I mean, that's actually a point. If you were brought up in St Ives, as I was, I went to a school called St Christopher's, and one of my father's early friends down here was the artist Malcolm Haylett, who was a very good portrait paper painter, one of the ones that was involved in the St Ives contribution to the Festival of Britain, with Barbara Hepworth and at that stage. And his daughter had a couple of daughters, Rosemary and Jennifer, and Jenny Haylett was a friend of mine, and we kind of got reacquainted when she came back to live in St Ives, sort of in the early noughties, and we were sort of having a meal together, and we were talking about this thing about learning art through osmosis. Like it's something that we grew up with, and I once asked the painter and printmaker Sheila Rolliner, who moved down in the 80s, what the attraction of St Ives was, and she said to me, it's one of the only places where you're considered normal if you're an artist. So we picked up. I mean, basically, the conversation with Jenny was that there were so many things that we just took as read and were common sense about the arts, but that can only occur if you're, if you grow up in that environment. Elsewhere, you could say the same sort of thing, and people wouldn't say, "Oh yeah, right, yeah, yeah, of course." They just think you were mad.
So I can see how the paper and you have been influenced by artists. Do you think there has been a likewise influence of the paper on what artists have been doing here? Have they had an eye on you and some of their discussions? They knew they would be advertised in the newspaper and that sort of thing?
It's always, yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, a facility, in particular our letters page, which is very much an open forum, is a medium that artists can use, and to different degrees of effect. Really, I mean, sometimes it can be very effective. I mean, Ben Nicholson tried very, very hard in the mid-50s to use the paper to influence the council to get more studios built in St Ives. Unfortunately, that failed. The council said that basically they turned it down, saying it was a nice idea, but they got to meet their quota of council houses first.
So it is actually an organ of open discussion.
Yeah,
amongst artists themselves and the community.
Certainly has been, yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can go back to, where if you're looking at the sort of periods after the Great War, or during the Great War, when D.H. Lawrence was down here, I came across a piece where I think it might have been of Lawrence's writing, where, for instance, Lawrence had been gone to a show in the Arts Club with with one of Edward Haynes' daughters there and what have you, and there was a bit of comment and debate about that. And certainly in that time, there were influential people in the arts regularly writing to the St Ives Times and corresponding in the letters columns and discussing ideas. And of course, at times like the formation of the split, the Penwith Society of Arts forming from the old St Ives Society of Artists, and all the controversy around that, that was aired through the letters columns. People like Guido Morris, and over the years of the St Ives avant-garde of my period, one of the biggest writers we had was Sven Berlin. Used to write quite regularly for us on all topics, obituaries for friends, tributes for friends. So so they made good use of the paper.
And I know that Sven Berlin was part of that group in the 80s you thought might become the new avant-garde, the new flowering, and I know you were aware of the great avant-garde.
I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure about that. You mean back when they were there in the 40s?
Which artists of the St Ives School did you know and like?
Well, I can't think of any I particularly disliked or dislike. Not in terms of artists, anyway. It's a kind of funny question. Or are you talking about their art? Or both?
I'm really talking about their art, because they can have been sometimes irascible and they sometimes argued with each other. And
absolutely, yeah.
But from your point of view,
I seem to remember, thought that was a great thing. Society splitting up and arguments and.
Well, I felt it was dynamic. It showed that people were thinking. And the other side of that doesn't mean that people are never thinking, but you just feel if things don't move, that they ossify. And the same work gets produced generation after generation rather than.
Well, I think so, and I think that's something I certainly share with Derek Guthrie, our friend Derek Guthrie, because debate, and when you don't have that debate and you don't have that passion, things do stagnate, don't they? Mm. But people seem to be so afraid of being upset or upsetting somebody these days that it closes minds to possibilities. But at the same time, the whole way we think about art has changed radically, I would think, from the 40s. But you also have to remember that this sort of St Ives and this whole kind of colony movement came out of a period that had been sort of stultified. The people had got into this system of working in studios, doing portraits, doing pictures from tableaus, illustrating historical events and things like that. And then suddenly trains came along, better transport came along, and they realised there was a whole world out there. So they kind of moved out and started to document it, which is where all the colonies sprung up. I get absolutely fascinated by these interlinks. For a long time, I think I probably told you this before, it always fascinated me that when Bob Dylan decided to get out of New York and raise his family somewhere quiet, his producer Albert Grossman said, "Why don't you come and live with me over in Woodstock," which they discovered. And of course Woodstock was an artist colony, still is, although the fact that so many musicians moved in there in the late 60s kind of detracts from this. But I recently came across an article in the Mail supplement, and I forget the lady's name, but she had been married to an artist in Woodstock at the same time as the Woodstock Festival, which was, I don't know, 65 miles further south, because they wouldn't allow them to have it in Woodstock. Talking about those things, and I thought, well, that was interesting. This artist is dead, but she's still alive, and I think it would be fascinating to talk to her about what the artists were doing bang in that period when the musicians got all the attention. And Woodstock was actually, I think, founded by a Yorkshireman. It wasn't. It was some of the colonies over here. St Ives, a lot of people give Whistler credit for founding it. So it was Americans. But you had this interchange and movement, worldwide, really. Well, I suppose worldwide if you think of Leach and Japanese connection in the pottery.
I mean, you and I, we often talk, nearly always, just about the artists, but you've said many times there's a huge international music connection with what goes on with the music.
Well, the thing about Woodstock that fascinated me was that while Bob Dylan was living there, Donovan was doing his trade as a busker in St Ives, and that was interesting because, of course, the media, as pure bollocks basically, came up with this idea that Donovan was, the British Bob Dylan, totally ignoring the fact that their music's fundamentally very different. It does very different things. And I can remember when I was a kid, you had to choose one or the other. You were sort of soft if you choose Donovan, but you're okay if you chose Dylan, sort of thing. As a fan, but I was never crazy about Donovan's music, but I did like it. I didn't dislike it, and I could see they were going, completely different courses. Yeah. So yes, there are not so much, musicians move through at that particular time. I did have a friend, Niall Timmings, who was a sort of a big man in Cornish folk and in Northern Ireland, who used to talk about times when, in the Beatnik area, when people moved into St Ives, and who you could find sitting around a campfire, and the number of big names in big groups that were down here in that period was quite fascinating, really. Mm-hmm. Well worth a study in the book.
I was wondering, this is not music, but how far and wide is the St Ives Times distributed?
Well, our publication day is Fridays, but we tend to come out on a Thursday now, on Thursday evening. So strictly speaking, we shouldn't do that, but it's so that we can come out on time in New Zealand.
Right.
So we publish news in New Zealand on a Friday morning through our electronics subscription service.
Where else?
And you might be interested, I mean, this is by the way, but it does relate on connections, on these curious connections that run through, let's call it the creative sphere, really. is that the first time we trialled a page electronically was with an obituary of a lady called, maiden name was Chrissy Bourne, who happened to be, she was married to the St Ives artist Hyman Seagull, but she had originally come over as a dancer with the Grateful Dead on their first tour of Europe. So we actually trialled the electronic one by sending the page, just the page of the obituary, over to the surviving members of the Grateful Dead that had helped us with her funeral, which was in Carmers Bay, just giving support and information. And it's quite interesting that the Grateful Dead seem to regard themselves as the natural heirs to the Beat Generation, because I think they use the same coffee bar in Palo Alto as Ginsberg and Kerouac and that crowd used to hang out in before they moved to Greenwich Village.
So talking about open discussion and people using the newspaper to discuss letters and get things moving politically and artistically, I think my publisher Julia wants to ask you a question about Derek.
Oh,
what is your relationship with Derek then?
Probably the same as everybody's relationship with Derek. You know, you have to listen a lot. Yeah, no, I mean, he's one of these guys where I know where he's coming from, really, and we're both very concerned, I think, about what corporate world does to individuals, and increasingly, I mean, more and more concerned about how the way the corporate world interacts with the arts. But it probably always has, hasn't it? I mean, you think of the Medicis and, you know, the big artistic patrons of the medieval world, and that's where that's where an artist had to get his crust, and I don't think they were necessarily treated any better then than they are now. I suppose it's a simple thing. If I'm commissioning an artist to do anything, I mean, I haven't commissioned much in my life, but where I have done, you just kind of give them a brief idea, and that's it. You don't try, particularly a fine artist. It's different with a graphic artist because you're looking to make something specific, and that's where the skills come in. But when you're commissioning a fine artist to do something, you just have to give them their head, because you want what they create. You don't want to see them create what you want, otherwise you'd use a different media. And I think probably now there is far too much. I mean, back in the when that show was put together, certainly the curators at the tape used to wait. You know, they used to look at people that had been in the arts 25 years and established some kind of a career. They weren't looking at people that came straight out of art college or anything like that. You know, they wanted to see a solid foundation of art. But now, education just seems to, if you like, turn out an artist as a product from a college. And it's certainly not like the old art schools, you know, which we sadly miss. So there is very much this attitude that anybody can be an artist, and you have a factory turning them out. There is very definitely a career path that youngsters can follow in the arts, which does mean having exhibitions in cities across the world and getting a reputation somewhere and then moving along. And that's exactly what curators want to see, because that's easy to organise and easy to manage.
That's definitely something the New Art Examiner has been discussing over the last 4 years since it re-emerged. Do you think that people in St Ives respect the New Art Examiner for discussing these kind of things, or do you think we're in a down period where people just aren't really that interested in rocking the boat?
I think we're in a down period where people aren't that interested in rocking the boat. And I think, I mean, from my point over the years, you know, I've done a fair bit of art criticism, and it's you reach a point where you realise, I mean, I usually set criteria My criteria really comes from the artist. I like to say, what are you trying to achieve as an artist, and and then I look at that criteria and see whether I think they're achieving it. And most of the artists that I know are and that I've covered are pretty true to that. They want to do something like that, and they say what they want to do. You do occasionally come across somebody that's like maybe just purely commercial. In St Ives, that section is generally referred to, usually by the artists themselves, as the painting business. I've had artists, I've been in the
which has grown greatly recently.
Yeah,
in St Ives. It's huge.
Is it? I mean, it always was. There always used to be a joke in the painting business about Tom Gower, who used to paint galleons. And we always used to say that last year's galleons were cheaper than this year's because they were last year's galleons. And Tom wouldn't, he wouldn't bat an eyelid at that comment, because that's what he did. He painted something that there was a market for, and that sort of illustrative stuff rather than the fine art kind of side of it. I mean, I always think the easiest way to think about pure art, fine art if you like, is very much like pure science or pure mathematics. This is something that chemists, for instance, at university might, during a degree, make a chemical, and that will stand on the shelf of the university, and it's going to sit there for years and years and years until somebody finds an application for it. And that's sort of pure science, really. You make something, you're not thinking of an application for it. And similarly, an artist that is working from the heart is doing the same thing. And however that piece of art then works, whether people think that's terrific, I love that, I want to watch that all day and hang it on their wall and it functions decoratively, or whether it's an applied artist coming along and saying, oh, wow, that's a terrific shape, I can make a car body out of that, or I can make a geodesic tent shape out of that, which will be more efficient, and then applies that fine art. That's how I tend to see the divisions breaking down. And the modernists in St Ives, of course, were mighty important, because the way those fairly simple shapes got applied into architecture, got applied into design, and how you had design groups splitting off from that work and so on, which makes them quite valuable. But you also have the whole dimension, which I think the colonies movements were very very much about, of coming and seeing life that involved a lot of human tragedy. Fishermen dying at sea, children suffering from disease, young families, losing the father, all that sort of thing, and wanting to take that on from a social realistic perspective. I suppose the most recent example of that, really, of somebody that was associated with the modern movement, though not a modernist, was Sven Berlin, who went out and documented in oils the gypsy compounds in the New Forest before they were finally closed and everybody moved into council flats. So you have that human thing that you can do with art.
Do you find the curators here in the galleries in St Ives engage with the newspaper?
Yeah, to some extent. Yeah. I mean, the Tate always keeps us informed of what it's doing, and certainly when it does community projects like the Silver Ball, where they decided, the Dutch artist decided to make a big silver ball and take it through the town, and that was kind of like interesting, but and obviously we was like fully involved with that, and covering that, and they let us know months before when it was going on. But that's an event, really, isn't it? So what you get out of that, how important that is, in the overall run of things. It certainly didn't make any major political statement.
And I suppose one of my final questions would be, do you think the New Art Examiner is living up to its historical worth? I mean, it was always without fear or favour, and it was like the loyal opposition as the book is being talked about.
Mm.
Do you think that I'm very concerned that we engage at the same sort of level of article writing and writers? We're engaging with writers, we're teaching them, we're getting writers internationally.
Yeah.
We're finding it quite difficult to get readership.
Yeah, I think everybody is.
On the webpage, fine.
Subscribers.
But subscribers to the print magazine, very small.
Yeah. I mean, you come down to that about people not wanting to read properly. And that is the big problem with the web in general. I mean, anybody on your website is going to, they're going to look at it briefly, pick some, pick a bit of information out of it before the next distraction comes along or filters through. They don't do what I do, which is, well, they don't seem to. Although it's quite interesting because books seem to be doing quite well again. And I think that's what we're all grappling with, really, is our medium. Which mediums do we talk to? Which mediums work better than the others? And if they're not working, why aren't they working? And I just think that's just a huge dilemma that we're working with. It's also like where does which magazines are successful? And I mean, I think the BBC History magazine seems to do quite well, I think, and that's got an expanding circulation, and that would be interesting. People are more interested in history. I think with us, for instance, I have been thinking now whether we actually do. We're not doing as much historical stuff as we used to, largely because we haven't got the contributors in that area that we used to have, and I'm wondering whether we're a bit out of time, because with more and more people, we're getting more people moving into St Ives that are, if you like, recent incomers. These are people that have they've got their pensions, they've got their savings. They're buying a house, probably one or two houses, so that they've got one to rent out to supplement the pension. And there are two types. There are the types that move into St Ives because it's a nice place to retire to, but know absolutely nothing about it, and aren't particularly keen to know anything about it. You've got others that do come in and want to get involved in the community, and want to be informed, and start joining in, contributing to things like the festival and the volunteer organisations and what have you. And generally, I think that's fine. You've then got another batch that come in, don't want to learn see how the town works or what's special about it, but want to change it. And they like it, but they'd really like it to be like London or wherever it is. So you've got all those three groups, and you're thinking, well, what do you cater for them? And in a sense, I would think that out there of the sort of the second group, the ones that want to learn about time, it might be more important to be publishing more articles on the history of the place, saying why this place is exactly like it is, and why people don't particularly want to change it that much. Because we have had a period now of a good 20 to 25 years where people have just seen the pound signs in the property market. And that's not just Cornwall, of course, that's all over the place.
Do you want to ask a last question?
Yes. How do you think the New Art Examiner can make a bigger impact on the local scene?
Asking the difficult questions, right?
The last.
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting that one either.
Or rather, we have a partnership with you.
Yeah.
How can we intensify this impact that we have we've grown by leaps and bounds
Yeah.
in this past few years.
In terms of on the net.
On the net.
Yeah.
Enormously. We're now at over 45,000
Yeah.
readers a month
Yeah.
from all over the world. But we'd like to make a...
Are those 45,000 subscriptions?
No.
No.
No, by
You see,
no
that's
means.
that's the difficulty, is that you don't really know the depth or the intensity of that readership. You know, whereas if, for instance, you know, my loyal readers, the loyalest of my readers are the ones that take both the electronic subscription and the snail mail subscription, and it costs them a heck of a lot of money to do that a year. But building up loyalty, can we do that in this age? You know, in fact, I was speaking to Dave at the just came in this morning. The Eddie Curry and his wife, who run the Milton and Lymington, the Milton Advertisers and Lymington Times, I think the title's called. I knew about it because his father carried on running this until he was in his 90s. But,
Wow.
and we were just having a general discussion. He was telling me about you know, the drop of circulation in printed media, you know, all over, and the number of newspapers that have gone. We may well have lasted so long because of the unique relationship with the arts. I mean, it's very symbiotic. And the Tate gave us a little exhibition in the cafe in 2010. Probably the only newspaper ever to have had an exhibition in the Tate, which is something. And this catalogue, I mean, the importance of the archive. You know, if you go through the Tate chronology on this, you've got where's it gone? It no longer exists. Yeah, the historic chronology here. Where you see these little references there to the newspaper article that refers to the event. So the whole chronology of St Ives is basically, I mean, there are other things that come into this, obviously letters, correspondence, catalogue entries, but the whole chronology is based on the David Brown's research going through the paper. So you have a historic record there, and it's quite interesting to think what happens to that sort of recording if we go. You know, as a, you know, who's got, because to have, if you like, the previous editors of this newspaper are very much my spiritual masters. I try not to deviate from anything that they've done in the past. There are some things that we're a little bit slack on, but they don't really relate to the arts. I mean, for instance, at the moment we should be highly critical of the way councillors waste taxpayers' money, and you know, parish precept, simply because that was something that Martin Cox said in his first editorial, that we should be, you know, right on top of the way councils are so casual with everybody else's money, really.
Quite right.
Yeah.
Tony, thanks so much for talking
Yeah,
to
no,
us.
it's always good to
This
talk to you
was
guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We shall be putting this up on the webpage, I hope.
Oh, right,
At some
okay.
stage.